Hello and welcome back to another evening together. Tonight we're going to spend some time with a question I've been sitting with for a while now, one that first occurred to me somewhere around my fourth rewatch of Dexter and never quite left. The question is this: how does a serial killer work inside a police department for over a decade, inside a homicide department no less, and never get caught? Not never get close to getting caught. He gets close plenty of times, but never actually caught. Dexter's arrested, never successfully prosecuted for his crimes, never unmasked by the institution that was literally sharing a building with him for years. And to be clear about what kind of evening this is, we're not here to be angry about that. We're not here to compile a list of grievances or to suggest that Dexter is a poorly written show, because it isn't. We're here because the question itself is genuinely interesting, and because the answer, when you actually sit with it, turns out to be more layered and more human than you might expect from what is, on the surface, a show about a forensics technician who moonlights as a vigilante killer. This is the kind of conversation you have at about 1 a.m. with someone who's seen the series too many times. We're going to move slowly through 8 seasons of near misses, institutional failures, personal blind spots, and one genuinely impressive run of a police department looking directly at something and deciding repeatedly that it isn't there. No hurry. There's plenty of ground to cover and know where we need to be. If you're new here, this is exactly the sort of thing we do on this channel. Long, unhurried walks through television we love, looking at the parts that don't quite hold up and the parts that hold up better than you'd think. If that sounds like your kind of evening, subscribing is always appreciated, and it genuinely helps more than you might expect. But more importantly, get yourself settled, find a comfortable spot, and let's spend the next couple of hours with Miami Metro. Before we get into any of it, I want to be precise about what the failure actually is, because I think it's easy to mischaracterize. The popular version of this conversation goes, Dexter is smart, Miami Metro is dumb. That's the whole story. And I understand the appeal of that framing. It's tidy. It explains things quickly. It also happens to be mostly wrong, or at least significantly incomplete. Dexter is smart, yes. He's careful. He has a rigid operational code that he follows more or less consistently across most of the series. He has genuine expertise in the one field most directly relevant to catching him. But he also makes mistakes, and he makes them fairly regularly. He keeps blood-slides as trophies. He gets photographed near scenes he shouldn't be near. He conducts conversations in public places that he absolutely should not be having. He keeps trophies inside his air conditioning unit in a flat where other people live. He is not an infallible criminal mastermind. What he is a man who has been positioned by circumstance and by design inside the specific institution that would be responsible for catching him. And that institution, for reasons that are sometimes structural, sometimes personal, and sometimes just gloriously human, never manages to close the gap. That's the story we're spending this evening with. Not Dexter's genius, Miami Metro's failure, in all its specific season-by-season, sometimes almost beautiful detail. And I say beautiful with full awareness of how strange that sounds, but I think you'll understand what I mean by the time we get to the end of it. The other thing I want to establish before we start is the time scale. Dexter's active career as a serial killer, starting from the early adult kills that predate the show and running through the events of season 8, spans around 2 decades. Miami Metro has approximately 2 decades of opportunities. Some of them are good opportunities, some of them are fleeting. Some of them are opportunities that the department doesn't even recognize as opportunities until they're already over. The cumulative picture of all those missed chances is what I find genuinely extraordinary about the show's construction. It's not that Miami Metro misses one obvious clue, it's that they miss dozens of them across years in different configurations for different reasons. That's not bad luck, that's a systemic condition. Let me start at the very beginning, because the failure of Miami Metro to catch Dexter didn't start when Dexter committed his first adult kill. It started before that. It started, in a way, with a decision made by a Miami homicide detective who knew exactly what he was setting in motion. Harry Morgan was, by all accounts, an exceptional police officer, decorated, respected, someone who understood not just the mechanics of investigations, but the institutional rhythms of law enforcement, how evidence gets processed, how suspects get identified, what makes a case closable, and what keeps it perpetually open. Harry spent his career inside Miami Metro, and he understood the department from the inside out. And then he raised a boy who had a compulsion to kill. And instead of only seeking professional help, he taught that boy how not to get caught. Now, the specifics of Harry's decision are complicated, and they carry a weight that the show takes seriously across all 8 seasons. Dexter. Original Sin goes into some of the texture of it. The young Dexter beginning his forensics internship, Harry watching with an expression that sits somewhere between pride and something considerably more troubled. But what I want to focus on right now is the specific professional choice Harry made, because I think it gets glossed over in favor of the more emotionally interesting parts of his story. Harry didn't just give Dexter a moral code, he gave him a cover. He was directed toward forensics, specifically blood spatter analysis, specifically at Miami Metro itself by Tanya Martin, and the reasons for that choice deserve some proper attention. A blood spatter analyst for a homicide department has legitimate reasons to be near violent crime scenes, has legitimate access to police databases, can look up criminal records, victim profiles, witness statements, case files without anyone asking why, has institutional credibility that means their presence at a scene doesn't raise questions from colleagues or responding officers, has professional expertise in the exact type of evidence most connected to violent crime, and crucially, has direct involvement in determining what that evidence means and how it gets reported. Harry knew all of this. He was a cop. He knew precisely what advantages that position would provide, and he steered Dexter toward it deliberately. The code of Harry, don't get caught, only kill the guilty, leave no trace, isn't just a set of ethical guidelines. Several of its specific rules are direct responses to how forensic investigations actually work. Don't leave trophies that can be traced. As part of Harry's rule to leave no traces or evidence, dispose of bodies where they can't be found. Keep your kills operationally separated from your professional identity. Harry wasn't writing philosophy. He was writing a procedural manual for not getting caught by the specific department he worked for. The code is, when you look at it this way, an insider's guide to Miami Metro's blind spots. This matters because it means the department was operating from the very beginning with a fundamental structural disadvantage. The person who had the most comprehensive knowledge of how Miami Metro investigated homicides, specifically what evidence gets collected, how it gets analyzed, where the gaps in the process are, used that knowledge to build a protective architecture around a killer, who was later handed a departmental badge by Tanya Martin. There's something genuinely unsettling about how considered all of it was if you sit with it long enough. Harry didn't leave things to chance. He didn't hope that Dexter would figure it out on his own. He engineered the solution with the same systematic attention he would have brought to any complex investigative problem. The problem he was solving just happened to be, how do I protect my adoptive son from the institution I've dedicated my career to? I've thought about what that says about Harry Morgan, and I keep arriving at the same slightly uncomfortable conclusion. He was a very good detective. He just pointed that skill entirely in the wrong direction. The department never had a clean chance at catching Dexter because Dexter was built from the ground up to be uncatchable within Miami Metro's specific institutional framework. Every system has gaps, and Harry spent 30 years learning exactly where Miami Metros were. There's a detail from Dexter, Original Sin, that I always find worth pausing on. When young Dexter begins his internship at the forensics unit, the professional who invites him in, Tanya Martin, describes his eye for detail as exceptional, as something she's rarely seen in someone at his stage. Harry watches this happen. He watches his son being absorbed into the institution, and his expression, if you're paying attention, isn't simple pride. It's the expression of someone watching a very long plan begin to execute itself. The department hired its most dangerous future employee and called it a talent acquisition. The person who made that possible was one of their own most respected senior officers. There's a specific quality of institutional irony in that, and the show never quite underlines it directly because it doesn't need to. It's just there, quietly in the background of everything that follows. One more thread to pull before we move on, and it's something that the Harry storyline returns to in Season 2 in a way that reframes everything. Harry eventually found out that his creation, the code, the careful positioning was working. But when he finally saw the reality of Dexter killing by that code, he was devastated rather than reassured. That Dexter was killing. That the boy he'd trained was out there following the system Harry had designed. And Harry, according to what Dexter learns later, took an overdose of his heart medication. Captain Matthews buries the official cause of death to protect the family. Suicide, not heart disease. Harry built the most complete protection a serial killer could ask for. Then he couldn't live with having done it. That doesn't make Miami Metro's failure his fault exactly. But it does tell you something about how clearly he understood what he'd designed. He understood it well enough that the knowledge destroyed him. And the machine he built kept running long after he was gone, protecting Dexter from a department that never quite knew why it couldn't close in on him. But let me also say something about what the code reveals about Harry as a professional, because I think it's easy to get so focused on his failure as a father or a guardian, depending on how you want to frame it, that the professional dimension gets lost. The code of Harry is, when you look at it carefully, an extremely good piece of criminal methodology. It's informed by specific knowledge of how forensic evidence gets processed. It accounts for victim selection in ways that minimize the likelihood of organized investigation. The choice to only kill people with established criminal records means that the victims are people whose disappearances attract less institutional attention, who have more plausible alternative explanations for going missing. That's not ethics, or not only ethics. It's also practical risk management by someone who understood exactly what category of disappearance would make the FBI dispatch a team versus what category would be chalked up to criminal lifestyle. Harry understood that certain missing persons generate a particular kind of official urgency and others don't. He designed the code to keep Dexter operating in the lower urgency category. The people Dexter kills are guilty of terrible things, yes, but that moral framing also happens to be extremely useful as a practical filter. Serial killers who prey on random members of the public attract maximum investigative resources. Serial killers who eliminate people who have already been documented by law enforcement as dangerous tend to generate investigations that are pursued with slightly less fire. This is uncomfortable to say plainly, but Harry thought about it plainly, and that's part of what makes the code so complete. The show gestures toward this in Season 2 when it becomes clear that many of the Bay Harbor Butcher's victims have criminal records. Basuka notes it. Lundy's profile acknowledges it. The implication that a killer operating to some internal selection criterion might be out there is briefly on the table, and then the focus returns to the methodological signature rather than the victim pattern. Harry anticipated that too, probably. The victim pattern is a lead. But it's a lead that raises uncomfortable questions about whether a vigilante killer is really the department's highest priority, and institutions are often very good at quietly not following leads that create difficult questions. Let me be precise about what it actually means, operationally, that Dexter works in forensics. Because I think the shorthand version, he's the blood guy, he controls the evidence, understates just how structurally compromised Miami Metro's investigative process was every single time a homicide scene had blood at it, which in Miami is most of them. Dexter doesn't just analyze blood, he is the department's recognized authority on what blood means. When there's a pattern at a scene, Dexter is the one who tells the detectives what that pattern indicates about the victim's position, the angle of the weapon, the likely height of the attacker. When there's a question about whether blood was present at a secondary location, Dexter runs the luminol. When there's a dispute about the interpretation of physical evidence in court, Dexter's analysis is the one that resolves it. He decides what the blood says, and in a department where his own crimes involve blood, specifically a single preserved drop on a glass slide taken from each victim, a blood spatter pattern consistent with bodies being methodically prepared for disposal, the conflict of interest is almost operatic in its scale. Take the Bay Harbor butcher investigation in Season 2. The FBI recovers 38 bags of human remains from the ocean floor. Those bags represent the physical evidence of dozens of murders, and they contain blood. And when Special Agent Frank Lundy needs someone to analyze the blood slides found in James Dokes' car boot, the investigation turns to the department's blood expert, which is Dexter, who sits there with an expression of almost academic interest as FBI technicians take their processing instructions from him on how to handle the trophies from his own crimes. I've genuinely rewatched that scene more times than I'd care to admit, and it still gets me. Lundy is not a stupid man. He's one of the sharper investigators we see across the entire run of the show. And yet the procedural logic of how investigations work, you use your department's expert for expert analysis, you don't second-guess institutional expertise without specific cause, means that the investigation's most sensitive evidence ends up in the hands of the person who created it. The system worked exactly as designed, and that's precisely the problem. Season 7 gives us a different version of the same dynamic. La Guerta finds a charred blood slide at the Travis Marshall Church crime scene, and her response is immediate and telling. She takes it to a private lab. She doesn't run it through Miami Metro's forensics unit. She goes outside the department's chain of evidence entirely, and the stated reason is that she doesn't want to tip her hand before she has something concrete. But there's something underneath that explanation worth naming. La Guerta doesn't fully trust the in-house process. She can't articulate exactly why, not yet. But some part of her understands that if this evidence is significant, having it processed inside the building is less reliable than having it processed outside it. She's right. She just doesn't know yet how right she is or why. The blood slide is the clearest example of the evidence problem, but it's not the only one. Dexter processes scenes where he has a professional reason to have been recently present, which is sometimes true and sometimes a convenient fiction, but which can always be defended. He's the one who determines which samples get fully logged and which are noted as inconclusive. He writes the reports. He testifies about findings, and when evidence occasionally points in a direction that would be professionally inconvenient, Dexter is optimally positioned to assess whether that evidence is worth pursuing or whether it represents noise in the data. There's a moment in the Bay Harbor butcher storyline where Masuka's analysis of the recovered bags identifies algae diatoms on some of the material, specific freshwater algae that could potentially narrow down the marina where the killer stored their boat. Dexter hears about this, and his immediate internal response is the very specific anxiety of someone who keeps a boat at a marina. He doesn't destroy the algae evidence, he doesn't interfere directly, he doesn't need to, because the information flows through him or near him in ways that give him the knowledge advantage of knowing what the investigation is pursuing before it pursues it. This is the evidence room problem in its practical form. Not that Dexter systematically destroys evidence, though he does occasionally do exactly that, but that his professional position means he always knows what the evidence is saying before anyone acts on it. He has the information advantage that no suspect should ever have in their own case. He knows what they know. He knows what lead they're about to pull. He's always one step ahead, not because he's smarter, but because his job description includes knowing what the investigation is thinking. In a real department with an active internal affairs structure, a forensic analyst with this many professional connections to ongoing homicide investigations would be reviewed regularly. Case assignments would be screened for potential conflicts of interest. The fact that the analyst was the adoptive son of a former senior officer might prompt some gentle additional scrutiny. None of that happens at Miami Metro. The oversight architecture is, to be generous about it, somewhat informal. and Dexter navigates it with the ease of someone who was trained by the person who understood it best. Harry knew where the gaps were. He built his son directly into one of them. There's also a dimension to this that I don't think the show dwells on, but which is worth naming explicitly. The social dynamics of a forensics lab inside a police department mean that the forensics team tends to exist slightly apart from the detective hierarchy. They're essential, but they're not running investigations. Their role is supportive, technically expert, deeply necessary, but downstream of the detective leadership in terms of authority. This means that while Masuka and Dexter are centrally involved in almost every significant case the department runs, they're not the ones making investigative decisions about where to look next. They provide the information, the detectives decide what to do with it. In practice, this creates a very specific dynamic. Dexter is always in the room when evidence is discussed, always consulted, always present, but never the person responsible for what happens next. If a lead is dropped, it's because a detective dropped it. If a case goes in the wrong direction, the decision was made above Dexter's official role. He's the expert witness, not the decision maker. This keeps him insulated from decisions he can influence but not be held responsible for, which is an extremely comfortable position for someone who has a professional interest in certain decisions going a particular way. The closest the show comes to examining this dynamic directly is the Bay Harbor Butcher storyline, where Matthews specifically assigns Dexter as the lead analyst on the blood slide evidence and then has to work with whatever Dexter tells him those slides say. Lundy asks the questions, Dexter answers them, and if Dexter's answers are technically accurate, while also being strategically incomplete, there's no immediate mechanism by which Lundy can know that. He's relying on the expertise of someone whose expertise, in this case, includes knowing exactly which details to emphasize and which to let lie quietly. Season 1 is Miami Metro's first extended year of professional proximity to Dexter as a functioning serial killer, and it's worth spending some time on what they see and don't see during it, because the patterns established in that first season turn out to be remarkably durable across everything that follows. The department's primary investigative focus in Season 1 is the ice truck killer, a serial killer leaving bloodless, carefully dismembered victims at various locations around Miami. The crime scenes are distinctive, even elegant in a clinical kind of way. Little blood, victims drained completely and arranged with an almost demonstrative precision. And Lieutenant Maria LaGuerta is leading the investigation. Now, to be fair to LaGuerta, she's a capable enough administrator, and she's not without genuine investigative instinct. But her Season 1 investigation of the ice truck killer is driven more by professional politics and personal preferences than by evidence, and the show makes no great effort to conceal this. She dismisses a suspect on insufficient grounds. She promotes her own theories in ways that foreclose other lines of inquiry. She's protective of the investigation in ways that are more about departmental territory than about solving the case. Here's something interesting about the ice truck killer scenes that gets lost in the larger story. Those crime scenes, bloodless, meticulously dismembered, forensically demonstrative, are almost tailor-made for a blood spatter analyst to examine. The absence of blood is itself a forensic statement. The manner of dismemberment speaks to professional knowledge. And Dexter, Miami Metro's blood expert, examines those scenes while simultaneously conducting his own parallel investigation into who the killer is. He's analyzing crime scenes left by his own biological brother, who is also taunting him personally while nominally processing evidence for the department. The conflict of interest is almost dizzying in its layers. What Miami Metro doesn't see, and to be fair, this is a difficult thing to see, is that the department's own forensics analyst is himself a serial killer operating in the same city. The ice truck killer isn't Dexter, but Dexter is a killer, and he's walking through those crime scenes making mental notes that are only partially about the official investigation. LaGuerta eventually fixes on a suspect, then another, but she is not ultimately led toward the resolution of the case by information that Dexter has strategically provided. The department solves the ice truck killer case, or rather the ice truck killer is identified through a convergence of Dexter's own investigation into his biological brother, pursued for entirely personal reasons, and the official Miami Metro investigation, with both running in parallel until they collide. The season introduces several other things worth noting. It introduces Dexter's daily routine as it intersects with the department. The morning donuts, the easy social performance, the way he navigates the office social dynamics with the practiced fluency of someone who has been doing it for years. He's good at this. He's been doing it for so long that it doesn't look like effort, and things that look effortless tend not to attract scrutiny. It introduces the idea that Dexter regularly works unusual hours, takes unexplained absences, occasionally arrives looking tired in ways that could be explained various ways, and that nobody at Miami Metro particularly interrogates any of this. He's a forensic blood spatter analyst. They work odd hours. Everyone has an inner life they don't fully disclose to their colleagues. It would be strange to question it. And it introduces the dynamic with Deborah, his adoptive sister, who is a detective in the department and whose close relationship with Dexter provides him with a kind of institutional social insulation. Nobody is going to be aggressively suspicious of the guy who's best friends with their colleague Deb. The social geometry of a workplace protects him almost as much as his professional position does. There's also the question of what Season 1 does with its most interesting investigative moment, which isn't anything La Huerta does, and isn't anything the official investigation produces. It's James Dokes walking into the room on Dexter's first day back at work and finding him at his desk, and the atmosphere changing. Dokes doesn't have evidence. He doesn't have a theory. He has a feeling, and it's correct. We'll spend proper time on Dokes in the next section. But it's worth naming here that Miami Metro's first-year proximity to Dexter produces exactly one person who accurately reads him. And that person is not leading the investigation. And that person's instincts are treated by the department as a personality problem rather than an asset. The ice truck killer case closes. The department is satisfied. Dexter is relieved. And the thing that should have been the most significant discovery of the season, that the department contains a serial killer in its forensics lab, goes unnoticed entirely because the department is looking at a different serial killer and can only hold one thing in focus at a time. Actually, let me go back to La Huerta for a moment, because her Season 1 investigation is a template for things she does across the rest of the series, and I think the pattern is worth naming clearly. La Huerta's investigative instincts in Season 1 settle on Rudy Cooper as her central suspect, before the full truth about Brian M.O.E. Zare's identity is established. She gets corrected mainly by her own investigative process, including decisions like reopening the Bay Harbor butcher case and using Hector Estrada as bait, with Dexter's indirect manipulation of evidence only influencing how the department responds. This establishes something important. La Huerta is capable of building and sustaining an incorrect theory against significant contrary evidence because her confidence in her own reads of situations is high and her willingness to revise is limited. The show is quite honest about this as a character trait. It makes her a difficult colleague and it makes her a flawed investigator. But, and this is a thing the show earns in Season 7, it also means that when she has a correct theory, she sustains it with the same tenacity. The same quality that makes her wrong about Rudy Cooper's specific role makes her right about Dexter's guilt years later, against considerable institutional pressure to let it go. One genuinely fascinating detail of Season 1, in the context of what Miami Metro misses, Brian M.O.E. Zare is working as a prosthetist under the name Rudy Cooper, and he begins a relationship with Deborah. He gets close enough to Deborah, close enough to the department through her, that he's essentially embedded in Miami Metro's social world while being the active serial killer they're trying to find. The department is looking for the ice truck killer in crime scene evidence while the ice truck killer is dating their detective. They are, as a department, almost extraordinarily bad at noticing the thing that is closest to them. It's a pattern that repeats in literally every season, but Season 1 is where it's established as a feature rather than a bug. The investigation also does something specific with La Guerta's relationship with departmental politics that sets up a pattern recurring throughout the series. La Guerta's choices in the ice truck killer investigation are shaped as much by what outcomes are good for La Guerta professionally as by what outcomes are most likely to be correct. She has a suspect she favors, and she constructs her investigation around that suspect rather than letting the evidence construct the suspect for her. This is a recognizable investigative failure mode, confirmation bias at the institutional level, where the department's preferred narrative of events shapes how evidence is interpreted rather than the other way around. Dexter understands this about La Guerta almost immediately. He doesn't exploit it in Season 1. The ice truck killer isn't his problem in a direct sense, but he observes it. He files away the knowledge that La Guerta's investigative instincts are guided by ambition as much as accuracy. He'll use that knowledge later in more direct ways. There's something else Season 1 introduces that gets less attention than it deserves: the department's relationship with the forensic evidence on Dexter's own kills. Several of his victims go missing during Season 1. People who fit his victim profile, who have documented criminal records, who disappear without traceable bodies. Miami Metro doesn't investigate these disappearances as a pattern. They register as separate missing persons entries, each one with a plausible explanation available in the victim's documented background. This is exactly what Harry's victim selection was designed to produce: a series of disappearances that the department doesn't connect to each other, because each individual case has an available alternative explanation and the overall pattern isn't visible from inside any single file. The system wasn't missing the pattern. The system wasn't built to look for this particular pattern. Missing criminal records don't generate the same automatic response as missing civilians. Harry knew that. He designed for it, and Miami Metro, doing exactly what it was built to do, didn't notice. There is a specific line in Dexter's internal monologue early in the first season that I keep coming back to. He's walking through Miami Metro, doing what he always does, smiling, carrying donuts, greeting his colleagues with that particular brand of cheerful detachment he's perfected over years. And then Dokes walks up to him. And the atmosphere in the scene changes completely. And Dexter, in his narration, asks himself, in a building full of cops, all supposedly with keen insight into the human soul, why is Dokes the only one who gets the creeps from me? It's a question that sounds rhetorical, but it isn't. It has a real answer. And the answer says something specific about everyone else in the building. James Dokes served in the U.S. Army Rangers. He ran operations in places where what was officially sanctioned and what actually happened were not always the same thing. He has killed people, not as a serial killer, but as a soldier, in circumstances that were sanctioned and sometimes weren't, and he carries that with him in a way that has shaped how he moves through the world and how he reads other people. When Dokes looks at Dexter, he sees something that his colleagues cannot see because they don't have the frame of reference for it. He's not seeing the blood slides or the kill room or the plastic wrap. He's seeing the shape of something, the outline of a person who has taken lives and felt something about it that they shouldn't feel. Dokes recognizes it because he's had to make peace with versions of that feeling himself, and he knows what the residue of it looks like in someone who carries it every day. This is why Dokes is uniquely positioned among everyone at Miami Metro, and why his failure to be believed is, in some ways, the department's most significant single failure across the entire series. He's not following a lead, he's not building a case, he just knows. And knowing isn't enough in an institution that runs on evidence. From the very first episode of Season 1, Dokes watches Dexter with a sustained attention that nobody else in the building turns his way. He challenges his work. He questions his schedule. He follows him on his lunch hour and notes where he goes. When Dexter provokes him, and Dexter does provoke him, deliberately, in ways that are almost playful in their precision, Dokes can't always control his response, which results in suspensions and a reputation for volatility that seriously undermines his credibility. This is the specific trap that the show sets for Dokes, and it's quite elegant as a narrative device, even as it's deeply unjust as a character outcome. The more accurately he reads Dexter, the more aggressively he pursues him. And the more aggressively he pursues him, the more he looks like a man with a personal grudge rather than a professional concern. His instincts are correct, his methods are a problem. And in an institution, those two things are not separable. The accuracy of your insight is only as useful as your ability to communicate it through channels the institution will accept. The suspension record is the clearest illustration of this dynamic. Dokes is suspended during the series for altercations connected to his pursuit of Dexter, including the headbutt incident I mentioned earlier, where Dexter deliberately provokes him into an outburst that LaGuardia cannot ignore. Each suspension removes Dokes from the building, which removes him from Dexter's proximity, which is exactly what Dexter needs. The provocation is calculated to produce exactly the institutional response it produces. Dexter knows that Dokes' volatility is a resource, and he spends it with precision. Meanwhile, within the department, Dokes' suspicion of Dexter becomes associated with his anger, rather than with his investigative accuracy. When Dokes says something critical about Dexter, colleagues hear it through the filter of his documented aggression, his suspension history, his personal animosity. They're not evaluating the content of what he's saying, they're evaluating the emotional register it's being said in. And emotional registers in institutions tend to determine how information is received more than the information itself does. There's a version of Dokes who calmly writes a memo about his specific concerns regarding Dexter Morgan, citing the specific behavioral anomalies he's observed, the gaps in Dexter's history, the inconsistencies in his professional conduct, and submits it through official channels. That version of Dokes might get a different response. But that's not who James Dokes is. He's a man who sees something and reacts to it with his whole body, and in the specific institutional environment of Miami Metro. That reaction destroys the credibility of what he sees. Dokes investigates Dexter's background in Season 1 and finds the suspicious gaps, the paper trail that doesn't quite line up, the early history that Harry carefully managed, the lack of documentation that should exist for a person of Dexter's age. He brings this to LaGuardia at one point and is essentially told to let it go. It's not evidence of anything. It's the suspicion of a suspended detective who has a documented adversarial relationship with the subject. The department does not act on it. Into Season 2, with the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation underway, Dokes' focus on Dexter intensifies. He puts a GPS tracker on Dexter's boat. He follows the tracking data to the Everglades. He arrives at the cabin and catches Dexter with the dismembered remains of a murder victim. He has, at that moment, everything he needs. He has caught the Bay Harbor Butcher in the act. There is no ambiguity. There is no alternative explanation. He has his man. What happens next is one of the more bitter reversals in the show, and I want to walk through it properly. Dexter disarms Dokes, the fight is close, and Dokes does manage to shoot him in the leg, which is actually more of a near miss than people give Dokes credit for, and imprisons him in a cage in the cabin. Dokes is now in the specific situation of being the person who caught the killer and being completely unable to tell anyone about it, because the moment he tries, his information is going to look insane. The Bay Harbor Butcher, who the FBI already half suspects is Dokes himself, is actually Dexter, and Dokes is being held in a cabin in the Everglades by the person he's been trying to expose for 2 seasons. Dokes spends weeks in that cage, maintaining his sense of self with what I genuinely think is an underappreciated dignity. He doesn't break, he doesn't capitulate. He keeps arguing with Dexter, keeps challenging his self-justifications, and in one extended conversation manages to draw out of Dexter an acknowledgement of Harry's suicide that Dexter hadn't previously confronted fully. Dokes is, even in prison, still investigating, still probing, still refusing to accept the version of events he's being presented with. And then Lila West burns the cabin down. Dokes dies in the explosion. Lila used Dexter's GPS device to find the cabin, having stolen it, and her response to finding Dokes there, to hearing him tell her that Dexter is the Bay Harbor butcher, is to choose Dexter's side. She opens a propane valve. She leaves the gas running. She is, in her own way, as responsible for the failure to catch Dexter as any institutional factor. She is the most specific piece of bad luck he encounters in 2 seasons of very bad luck, converted somehow into a very specific kind of survival. The department's response to Dokes' death tells you a great deal about how the institution processes uncomfortable information. The FBI accepts the Dokes as butcher narrative because it's politically useful for everyone. The case closes. La Guerta, who was the only senior officer who maintained any doubt about Dokes' guilt, eventually loses that battle. Masuka makes a passing observation that a killer as careful as Dokes would never accidentally blow himself up, and nobody follows it. It floats there for a moment, accurate and perceptive, and then it disappears. The department's only officer who was ever genuinely right about Dexter is dead and officially blamed for his crimes. There's something that I find genuinely sad about that, even after all these rewatches. Dokes wasn't always likable. He was abrasive and sometimes cruel in how he expressed his suspicion. But he was right. He was right from the beginning. He was the most accurate investigator in the building on the most important case the department ever had. And the system he worked inside couldn't find a way to use what he knew. The specific rhythm of Dokes' suspicion deserves a closer look, because it's not static across the 3 seasons he's in. In season 1, his hostility toward Dexter is present, but not yet fully articulated. He's acting on discomfort. He's reacting to something in Dexter's energy that he can feel but hasn't yet given a name to. The headbutt incident, Dexter delivers a headbutt to Dokes in his own office, an act of deliberate provocation that is genuinely startling, and then walks away while Dokes chases him down the corridor and gets suspended for the ensuing altercation is worth examining as a piece of strategy. Dexter is provoking Dokes into an outburst that will undermine Dokes' credibility. He knows exactly what he's doing. He knows that Dokes' reputation for volatility is a resource, and he's spending it deliberately. By season 2, the suspicion has sharpened into something more methodical. Dokes isn't just hostile anymore. He's following Dexter. He's checking the marina. He's running background research into Dexter's history. He's building what would, under any other circumstances, look like a preliminary investigative file. Except he's doing it mostly alone, off the books, during and after a period when he's been suspended from the department and has no official standing to conduct any investigation at all. This is the specific legal and institutional trap he's in. The more accurately he sees Dexter, the more he needs to pursue him in ways that have no official sanction. And the more he pursues him in ways that have no official sanction, the less institutional weight anything he finds can carry. There are moments in season 2 where Dokes gets very close to being able to articulate what he knows in a way that someone else might hear. A conversation with La Guerta on the beach where he talks about his suspicion of Dexter, and La Guerta, who cares about Dokes and trusts his instincts, listens. She doesn't fully believe his suspicion about Dexter at that point, but she's listening. She's the closest thing to an institutional ally Dokes has in his investigation, and the show acknowledges this by giving her a long arc in season 7. That is, in many ways, the completion of what Dokes started. He found the lead. She eventually became suspicious of Dexter and started investigating whether he was the Bay Harbor butcher, about 5 years later. The cruelest part of Dokes' story is that his imprisonment in the cabin doesn't end his investigation. Even caged, he keeps pushing. He gets Lila to listen to him, tells her directly that Dexter is the Bay Harbor butcher. He believes in that moment that he's finally found someone who will act on the information, and Lila's response is to choose Dexter. Not because she disbelieves Dokes, because she loves Dexter in the specific, obsessive way that she loves things, and she would rather protect him than let the truth survive. Dokes is right up until the explosion takes him. And in the cold official record, he ends up as the killer he was trying to expose. Let me talk about the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation properly, because I think it represents something that gets underappreciated about Dexter's survival across the series. It wasn't just competence that got him through season 2. It was an extraordinary, almost implausible sequence of coincidences, other people's decisions, and one specific woman's obsession, all landing in exactly the right order. The Bay Harbor Butcher storyline begins when divers discover 38 bags of human remains in the ocean off Miami. This is, in the most literal possible sense, the discovery of Dexter's underwater graveyard. Years of carefully selected victims wrapped in garbage bags, dumped from his boat at what he thought was a secure location. The discovery triggers an FBI investigation, and the FBI sends Special Agent Frank Lundy to lead it. Lundy is the most genuinely competent external investigator the show introduces, and the investigation he runs in Season 2 reflects that. He builds a profile based on the evidence that is, when you actually examine it, quite accurate. He identifies that the Butcher is meticulous, methodical, familiar with law enforcement procedure, likely connected to the criminal justice system. He narrows the suspect pool to law enforcement. He uses the algae diatoms on the rocks from the bags to try to identify the marina where the killer launched his boat. He pursues every thread with a patience and lack of ego that is, frankly, rare in either fictional or real police procedurals. And he comes close. He comes genuinely close in a way that I don't think the show always gets full credit for. The marina investigation gets Lundy within a specific radius of where Dexter actually keeps his boat. If the algae analysis had been slightly more specific, if the marina records had been more complete, if someone had cross-referenced the slip rentals with Miami Metro employee records, any of those things might have closed the gap. Here's where the structural problem from the earlier section comes back in. Dexter is ordered to process the blood slides found as part of the Bay Harbor Butcher evidence. This is the assignment that should not have happened. Not because Lundy is negligent, he has no reason to suspect his assigned forensic analyst at this stage, but because the institutional logic of using your expert produces exactly the wrong result in the specific case. Dexter analyzes his own trophies. He controls the narrative of what those slides tell the investigation, and the investigation proceeds on the basis of information that Dexter has, at some level, shaped. Meanwhile, Dokes is tracking Dexter independently using the GPS device on the boat, and he arrives at the cabin and catches him in the act. This is the actual closest moment. This is the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation's moment of genuine resolution. And it happens outside the official investigation entirely, through one man's correct instinct and unauthorized surveillance. Dokes is in that cage. The investigation is days from potentially converging on the correct location through the algae and marina leads. And then Lila West steals Dexter's GPS device, finds the cabin, and makes her choice. The explosion at the cabin severely damages and obscures most of the evidence. It destroys Dokes. It also accidentally produces the most convenient possible closure for the investigation, because Dokes' physical presence at the cabin, combined with the blood slides found in his car boot, which Dokes has stored there, completes the official picture. The FBI gets a dead suspect who is at the scene. Deputy Director Adams is satisfied. Lundy is not entirely satisfied, but he's a federal agent with other cases, and the institutional pressure to close this one is considerable. Lundy's departure from Miami is the investigation's quiet death. He leaves with loose ends he can't tie because the political wind is behind the Dokes conclusion. And I think Lundy knows it's not entirely right. The show doesn't make a big thing of that, but there's something in Keith Carradine's performance across the back end of Season 2 that reads like a man accepting an outcome he doesn't fully believe in, because he doesn't have the evidence to push it further. There's one more detail in Season 2 that I think deserves a moment because it's the show being quite honest about Dexter's luck. Masaoka's observation that Dokes wouldn't have blown himself up by accident is accurate, and nobody acts on it. That remark, a killer as intelligent and resourceful as Dokes would never have made such a basic mistake, is the closest the official investigation comes, after the case closes, to acknowledging that something doesn't quite fit. And then it's set aside because the case is closed and people have moved on, and there are other murders in Miami that need attending to. The Season 2 investigation is the show's clearest demonstration of how institutional preference for resolution can override investigative accuracy. There's one dimension of the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation that I want to come back to because I mentioned it briefly, but I don't think it got its full moment. Dokes has a GPS tracker on Dexter's boat. This is the specific piece of technology that leads him to the cabin, and the way Dokes got access to that tracker is worth thinking about. He went and got it, off his own back, unauthorized, using his own resources while still on active duty, and then continuing that unauthorized work after he was suspended from active duty and had no official standing to conduct any investigation. The point I want to make about this is that Dokes' most productive investigative act in the whole series, the act that actually produces physical evidence, that puts him in the same location as Dexter and a body, that represents the single most complete near capture of the show's run, is something the institution played no role in. It's purely personal, purely motivated, purely Dokes, working without resources, without sanction, without support, because he is certain enough about what he's looking at that he doesn't need the institution to confirm it. That's the mirror image of the evidence room problem. The evidence room problem is Dexter using institutional position to protect himself. Dokes catching him at the cabin is someone working completely outside institutional channels to achieve what the institution, with all its official resources, couldn't do. In the end, the institution's most significant near catch came from the person the institution least wanted to listen to, working in exactly the way the institution would have forbidden, producing exactly the evidence the institution would never have helped him find. The institution failed to catch Dexter. A man who the institution had officially sidelined came closer than anyone in a sanctioned investigation ever did. There's something in that which I keep coming back to and which I can't quite shake. The official process produced nothing. The expelled detective with a grudge and a GPS device found the body, and then a gas-fueled fire and an obsessive woman and a cabin explosion closed the chapter, and the institution took credit for a resolution it had no part in producing. Let me also note, since we're nearing the end of the Season 2 discussion, that the specific way the Bay Harbor Butcher case closes is worth examining as an institutional response. The FBI gets a dead suspect found at the scene of one of the Butcher's confirmed kill locations. Physical evidence connects that suspect to the crimes. The case closes. But the closing is driven by the same institutional pressure toward resolution that has shaped the investigation throughout. Nobody on the official team pushes back seriously on the Dokes conclusion because the Dokes conclusion is convenient, and because the alternative, that the Butcher is still out there, that the investigation is still open, that someone with access to law enforcement evidence and resources is still killing, is a deeply uncomfortable thing for a department to have to publicly sustain. Closing the case is easier. Closing the case is what institutions do when they can. And so it closes. The evidence pointed toward Dokes in ways that were convenient. The inconvenient details, the too neat explosion, Masuka's observation, La Guerta's persistent doubt, didn't produce enough friction to reopen what the department wanted closed. Dexter survived Season 2 not because the investigation was bad. He survived because the investigation was good enough to get close, and then a combination of Dokes' imprisonment and Lila's obsession and institutional pressure for closure produced an ending that served everyone's needs except the truth's. Let me also spend a moment on the specific detail of what Lundy builds during Season 2, because I think Lundy deserves more credit than he usually gets in discussions of this investigation. His profile of the Bay Harbor Butcher is genuinely sophisticated. He identifies the killer as someone probably connected to law enforcement. He notes that all the identified victims were murderers who had slipped through the law and concludes that this reflects a selection criterion rather than coincidence. He picks up on the fact that the dismemberment and disposal method reflects professional knowledge of how bodies decompose and how marine evidence degrades. He is essentially building toward the conclusion that the butcher is someone who works with crime and evidence professionally. That's correct. That's exactly right. He just can't close the last gap between works with crime and evidence professionally, and the specific person in the building who fits that profile. Partly because the most obvious professional candidate, Dokes, becomes the investigation's dominant suspect, with the planted slides later sealing the case against him. Partly because Dexter's professional demeanor and social presentation don't quite match the psychological profile Lundy expects for someone operating at the Bay Harbor butcher's level of controlled violence. There's a version of this investigation where Lundy follows the marina lead further before the cabin explosion, where the algae analysis produces a specific enough result that the slip registrations at the relevant marinas get cross-referenced against Miami Metro employees. Dexter's boat at Coral Cove Marina is registered in his name. His Miami Metro employment record is public record within the department. The distance between Lundy's investigation and that specific database query is, by the end of the season, not as large as it might look. The cabin explosion closes the investigation after it gets there. Dokes is dead. The police have Dokes' body they found at the scene of the cabin explosion. The politically inconvenient possibility that one of Miami Metro's employees is the butcher becomes unnecessary to pursue, because there's already a dead suspect and the department needs to be operational. Institutions have a very specific pressure toward closure, and Season 2's ending serves that pressure perfectly. There's a category of Miami Metro failure that I think is both the easiest to overlook and the most genuinely interesting to examine, and it's this. The number of people in and around the department who had adjacent information about Dexter or adjacent opportunities to notice something wrong, and whose attention was directed elsewhere by the entirely legitimate weight of their own lives. This is a different kind of failure from the structural ones we've been talking about. It's not about evidence chains or conflict of interest or institutional politics. It's about the very human phenomenon of people having full inner lives and full professional lives and full personal lives, and directing their attention toward the things that feel most urgently real to them. And Dexter, by design and by instinct, almost never makes himself feel urgently real to the people around him. Start with Tom Matthews, the captain who covers up Harry Morgan's suicide and the circumstances of his death. Matthews is protecting Harry's legacy. He's protecting Dexter and Deborah from knowing the specific shape of their father's guilt. He's also protecting his own connection to Harry, his own history with the Morgan family, and his pension and professional standing from the complications that would arise if any of it came out. These are not the motivations of a villain, they're the motivations of a person who has known someone for decades and is managing, as best he can, the complicated legacy of that relationship. The effect of Matthew's protection is to bury information that, if it had been available, might have prompted different questions about Dexter's early life and professional trajectory. The cause is entirely human. Then there's Rita Bennett, who becomes Rita Morgan, who knows that Dexter has secrets she doesn't understand and accepts a cover story in Season 2 that, if you think about it, she really shouldn't accept. The drug addiction narrative. Rita's second marriage was to Paul Bennett, a man whose addiction she lived with closely enough to recognize its physical and behavioral signs. And Dexter, running a fake NA attendance to cover his disappearances, displays none of those signs. Zero. He's not withdrawing, he's not using, he's not showing the physical markers of addiction or recovery. He's just attending meetings. Rita accepts this because she wants to. Because the alternative, that the stable, reliable, kind man she's building a life with is hiding something considerably worse, is not something she can afford to want. Rita has been through one catastrophic relationship already. She has children. She needs Dexter to be what he appears to be. and the strength of that need is enough to override a set of instincts that, in a different emotional context, would have caught the inconsistency immediately. Angel is worth a mention here because Angel is actually a good detective in many ways, warm, persistent, decent at reading people. And yet he never registers the slightest unease about Dexter across the entire run of the original series. Part of this is structural. Angel isn't positioned to see the things Doak saw. Part of it is temperamental. Angel is fundamentally an optimist about people, and optimists about people tend not to go looking for the dark thing underneath the cheerful surface. And part of it is just the way workplace friendships work. You build up a picture of someone through shared professional context, small talk, the texture of daily proximity, and that picture accumulates enough warmth and mundane familiarity that it becomes very difficult to overlay it with something darker. Masuka is in some ways the most extraordinary case. Vince Masuka is professionally extremely sharp. He catches forensic details that other people miss. He notices the algae. He makes the observation about Dokes that nobody follows up on. He is, in his area of expertise, genuinely excellent. And he is cheerfully, completely, entirely oblivious about Dexter for 8 seasons, across all of the evidence and all of the near misses, because his social intelligence and his professional intelligence seem to occupy genuinely separate rooms in his mind. And if you wanted a cleaner example of the gap between professional and social intelligence, Masuka is it. He can reconstruct a homicide from blood evidence with remarkable accuracy. He cannot look at his colleague and sense what Dokes sensed on the first day. Those two kinds of perception use completely different faculties, and Masuka's are strongly weighted toward the technical. Dexter's camouflage isn't primarily technical, it's social. He understood from early on that the best way to not be noticed is to be noticed in a specific, limited, non-threatening way. As the slightly awkward donut-bringing forensics guy who is fond of his sister and reliably good at his job. He positioned himself as someone who occupies a small, well-defined space in the social ecosystem of the department. And people with small, well-defined social spaces get a great deal of professional and personal latitude because they don't seem to need watching. There's a quality to Dexter's performance at Miami Metro that I think of as the advantage of not being interesting. He doesn't create drama. He doesn't compete for credit. He doesn't generate the kind of interpersonal noise that draws attention. He's the person everyone is glad to have around and nobody thinks about when they're not in the room. In an office environment, that's an invisible person. In a homicide department, invisible is the safest thing to be. And then there's the ongoing La Guerra Batista romantic tension across seasons 4 and 5, and Quinn's various relationship complications and the departmental politics around promotions and case assignments and professional credit. All of it real, all of it taking up genuine bandwidth, all of it meaning that Miami Metro at any given moment has numerous things demanding the attention of its investigators that are not Dexter Morgan. There's one more figure worth examining in the adjacent information category, and that's Paul Bennett, Rita's former husband, who makes an extended appearance in Season 1 and the early part of Season 2. Paul is an abusive addict who has served prison time for domestic violence, and his relationship with Dexter is one of mutual hostility mediated by Rita and her children. Paul suspects Dexter of something, not serial killing specifically, but of not being what he presents himself as. He says this explicitly at various points. There's something off about Dexter, something he can't name, something that doesn't add up. Paul's problem is that he's the wrong messenger. He's Rita's abusive ex-husband, a drug addict with a documented history of violence and manipulation. Everything he says about Dexter gets filtered through that context. When he claims Dexter is hiding something, Rita and the department hear it as a recovering addict trying to sabotage his ex-wife's new relationship, which is plausible, which is, in the context of their history, more plausible than the alternative. Paul ends up back in prison, in part because of Dexter's maneuvering, and his suspicions about Dexter die with his credibility. But he was right about the most basic thing. Dexter is hiding something. He just had no way of getting anyone to listen to him and no way of figuring out what, specifically, was being hidden. His correct instinct, like Dokes's correct instinct, was routed around by the institutional and social machinery that surrounds Dexter. The wrong person saying the right thing turns out to produce the same outcome as saying nothing at all. And then there's Angel at the departmental level, who I want to mention specifically because Angel's goodness is, in a very particular way, one of Dexter's most reliable protections. Angel is a genuinely decent man. He's warm, empathetic, and has a genuine investment in the well-being of people around him. These are not bad qualities. They're excellent qualities for a person to have. They're also qualities that make it very difficult to maintain the sustained suspicion necessary to notice that a cheerful, reliable colleague is doing something terrible. Angel's decency is a professional disadvantage in this specific context. Dexter has always understood this intuitively, which is part of why his social performance at Miami Metro tilts so heavily toward the warm and reliable register. He's giving Angel something to respond to that Angel's own personality is optimized for receiving. There's a pattern that runs through seasons 3 and 4 that I find genuinely fascinating as a piece of television construction, and also somewhat rueful to watch if you're paying attention to what Miami Metro is actually accomplishing. The pattern goes like this. The department investigates something. Dexter investigates something different for entirely personal reasons. Dexter's investigation produces results. The department eventually learns about those results through channels that don't include anything Dexter explicitly told them. And then the department acts on the results of an investigation it didn't actually run. Season 3, The Skinner Investigation. George King is a Nicaraguan military enforcer who kills his victims by skinning them, a distinctive and extremely traceable method. Miami Metro spends most of the season trying to identify and locate King while Dexter is managing a completely different problem, namely his complicated relationship with Miguel Prado, the assistant district attorney who has learned his secret and wants to be his partner. Dexter kills Miguel Prado. He frames it convincingly. He points the department's attention toward a different conclusion. And then he delivers the Skinner to the department through his own encounter with King in circumstances that are eventually explained as self-defense. And the season's official investigation closes on a conclusion that Dexter largely influenced. Season 4 is more interesting and more painful because its failure has specific human consequences. Arthur Mitchell, the Trinity Killer, has been killing for approximately 30 years at the time the season is set. He operates in a cycle that Lundy, who investigated him before his retirement from the FBI, identified as a pattern of 3 kills: exsanguination in a bathtub, forced fall from a building, bludgeoning, 3. Lundy built his entire investigative framework around a cycle of 3, and when Deborah brings the Trinity case back to the department after his death, Miami Metro's understanding of the killer is rooted in his stolen notes and tapes. The problem is that Dexter, through his own independent investigation of Arthur Mitchell, pursued not to catch Trinity but to understand him, to learn from him, to study how this man maintains a normal family life while killing across decades, has already identified that the cycle is 4, not 3. There's a burial too, a 4th victim. The first victim in Trinity's cycle is a missing boy. Dexter knows this. Miami Metro doesn't know it until much later in the season, when Dexter investigates missing boys, puts the pattern together, and realizes that it's not 3 kills per cycle, but 4. That gap in knowledge between what Dexter knows and what the department knows runs through the entire season and has consequences. The department is, for most of season 4, operating on a model of Trinity's behavior that is 1 kill short of accurate. They're anticipating the wrong moment to act. They're looking for a pattern that doesn't quite match what's happening. And by the time they have an accurate picture of who Arthur Mitchell is and what his full cycle looks like, Dexter has been on road trips with him, has shared his car with him, has watched him build a coffin in his garage. Now, I want to be careful here because it's very easy to frame Season 4 as Miami Metro's failure killing Rita, and that framing isn't quite right. The truth is more uncomfortable than that. Dexter's choice to delay killing Mitchell because he wanted to understand him, wanted to learn the secret of maintaining a double life, wanted something from this man before eliminating him, is what allowed Mitchell enough time and freedom to kill Rita. The department didn't give Mitchell that time, Dexter did. The department's investigation was too slow, yes, but Dexter's hesitation was the thing with direct consequences. That said, Miami Metro's Trinity investigation is a remarkable document of investigative momentum failing to produce a result. The department identifies the pattern, Dexter gets the 4-kill cycle correct, eventually they zero in on physical descriptions from witnesses. And then, in a detail that still baffles me, they spend significant time treating Stan Beaudry as a Trinity lead based on Lundy's files, a large white man with blue eyes who fits the general description before new evidence clears him. Meanwhile, Arthur Mitchell is a church-going family man in the suburbs who has so successfully constructed a life of respectable normality that his own family has no idea who he is, and the department only gets to him after his killing cycle has already claimed multiple victims. The season ends with Dexter killing Arthur Mitchell in the episode's final minutes, and then coming home to find Rita dead in the bathtub, Harrison in her blood. It's one of the most devastating endings in the show, and the department's official Trinity case, which finally identified Mitchell as the suspect after his death, closes with most of the actual investigative work having been done by Dexter in a personal capacity for reasons that had nothing to do with official justice. There's a specific detail about the Trinity investigation's final stages that I think deserves mention, because it shows how close the department comes and how that closeness doesn't translate to anything useful. By the time the investigation has correctly identified Arthur Mitchell as the suspect, Mitchell is still alive and being actively hunted. Dexter has killed him in the final episode of the season, so when the department finally gets there, when they have his real name, his real address, his real history of over 30 years of kills across the country, what they have is a closed case. The suspect is still alive, the victims are identified. The matter is officially resolved. What the department doesn't know is that their forensics analyst killed him. What they don't know is that their forensics analyst watched Arthur Mitchell build a coffin in his garage and rode with him to Tampa on a road trip and could have ended the investigation at any number of points before Rita died. The official Trinity investigation in Miami Metro's records is a case that ended correctly. Dexter, in his private accounting, knows it ended too late and for the wrong reasons. There's a specific sequence in Season 4 that I keep coming back to because it crystallizes the whole Season 4 investigative failure so neatly. The department is trying to identify the Trinity killer's victim pattern. Deborah has been pursuing it. LaGuardia, initially skeptical, has agreed to give the investigation one more day to produce results. Angel has been making calls to other cities. And in that same period of time, Dexter is riding with Arthur Mitchell in Mitchell's van, going to Tampa, stopping Mitchell from trying to kill himself. The department is trying to figure out who Trinity is and what he does, and Dexter is right there in the passenger seat. If Dexter had wanted to hand the department Arthur Mitchell at any point during Season 4, really wanted to, without the complicating personal project of wanting to learn from him, he could have done it. He knew where Mitchell lived, he knew his real name, he knew his patterns, he could have made an anonymous call. He could have left the evidence in a way that the investigation would have found him. He didn't, for reasons that are his own, and those reasons cost Rita her life. Miami Metro didn't fail to catch Trinity because they were bad detectives. They failed to catch him in time, partly because the one person who knew everything chose not to share it. The PRAHDO situation in Season 3 deserves a closer look, because it represents a specific kind of failure that's different from the other investigative misses. Someone inside Dexter's personal orbit learns his secret, and the department never finds out. Miguel Prado is the assistant district attorney. He's a senior legal figure with direct professional connections to Miami Metro. He learns Dexter is a serial killer. He doesn't report it. He wants a piece of it. This isn't institutional blindness. It's the opposite. Someone with significant institutional standing who can see clearly and makes an active choice not to use that clarity in the direction of justice. Miguel Prado's corruption isn't unique to Dexter. The show establishes fairly early that he has a long history of pursuing results over due process, but the specific choice to not report Dexter and instead become his partner in extrajudicial killing is extraordinary. And when Dexter eventually kills Prado and frames another criminal for it, the institution closes the Prado case without the faintest suggestion that their forensics analyst might have been involved. One of the quiet tragedies of the Trinity investigation in Season 4, separate from what happens to Rita, is the extent to which the department's resources are committed to a case that Dexter is simultaneously working in parallel. Every briefing room discussion about Trinity that Dexter sits in on is information he already has. He knows Mitchell's pattern. He's met Mitchell. He's been in the man's house, sat at his table, ridden in his van. While the department is methodically cross-referencing bathtub murders across 3 decades of records, Dexter is essentially living alongside the active killer they're trying to identify. And the gap between what Dexter knows and what he tells the department is the gap in which Rita's murder becomes possible. If you've been enjoying this slow walk through Miami Metro's institutional track record, subscribing to the channel is a genuinely kind way to support more evenings like this one. It's free, it takes about 2 seconds, and it helps more than you probably expect. But no pressure at all. We've got quite a bit more to get through, so let's keep going. Joey Quinn is a complicated figure in Miami Metro's relationship with the truth about Dexter, and I don't think he always gets the credit he deserves for being the person who came closest to a genuine external investigation in the middle seasons of the show. Quinn arrives in Season 3 and becomes a regular in Season 4. He's not a pristine detective. The show makes it clear fairly early that Quinn has a history of looking the other way and occasionally doing things that would make internal affairs interested, which is part of why his specific arc in Season 5 is so ironic. But he's perceptive in ways that the show doesn't always foreground. And in Season 4, when he notices the alias that Dexter used while following Arthur Mitchell, Kyle Butler, the name Dexter gave when he was insinuating himself into the Mitchell family's world, Quinn files it away. The Kyle Butler question is a small thread, but it's a genuine one. Quinn asks around about it. He cross-references it. He notices that one of the Mitchell family's descriptions of Kyle Butler maps onto Dexter Morgan in ways that are hard to explain away. And he becomes, quietly, suspicious that Dexter was involved in something connected to Rita's murder in ways that nobody has examined. In Season 5, Quinn takes that suspicion somewhere it probably shouldn't go. He hires Stan Liddy, a former Miami Metro officer who was let go following an internal affairs investigation, to conduct private surveillance on Dexter. Liddy is good at his job in a very specific way. He's thorough, he's patient, and he's motivated by his own desire to rehabilitate himself professionally. The surveillance operation is unauthorized. It uses departmental equipment through unofficial channels, and it produces results. Liddy gets footage of Dexter and Lumen Pierce transporting what appears to be a body on Dexter's boat. That footage is real. It shows what it shows. And for a brief period, Stan Liddy has the most concrete evidence anyone has accumulated against Dexter since Dokes caught him at the cabin in the Everglades. Then Dexter kills Liddy in the back of his surveillance van. Quinn arrives at the van shortly afterward, looking for Liddy, and doesn't gain entry. A drop of Liddy's blood leaks from the van's undercarriage and lands on Quinn's shoe. He doesn't notice it. He walks away. La Huerta, arriving later at the scene of the discovered van, spots the blood on Quinn's shoe and becomes immediately interested. This is the moment that derails what might have been a genuinely significant investigation. Because now Quinn has a problem, pursuing the Dexter angle, pushing the Kyle Butler question, pushing the surveillance footage. requires explaining how he got the footage, which requires explaining Liddy, which requires explaining an unauthorized surveillance operation that used departmental resources and which Quinn requisitioned personally. The blood on his shoe connects him to Liddy's murder scene. He needs legal representation, not investigative momentum. Quinn deletes the call records from Liddy's phone that connect them. He lawyers up. He stops pursuing Dexter entirely because the only way to pursue Dexter now is to expose himself to a criminal investigation. And the blood on his shoe makes that exposure potentially catastrophic. So the Kyle Butler question goes unanswered. The surveillance footage disappears with Liddy's death. Dexter throws the laptop into the bay, and Quinn's genuine, if unauthorized, investigation collapses. Not because Dexter was particularly clever in the endgame, but because the institutional rules that were supposed to prevent unauthorized surveillance operations also prevent Quinn from explaining how he got the evidence that would expose Dexter. There's a quiet irony here that I think the show handles well. The institution's own procedural protections, the rules against unauthorized surveillance, the rights of suspects, the chain of evidence requirements, serve in this case as the mechanism of Dexter's protection. Quinn couldn't pursue a legitimate investigation because his investigation was never legitimate. And an illegitimate investigation, when it produces evidence that can't be used and that its investigator can't even acknowledge. Deborah's involvement is worth noting here too. Quinn is romantically entangled with Deborah during this period, and his growing suspicion about Dexter's connection to Lumen and the Barrel Girl case, along with his secret investigation with Liddy, is in part what strains their relationship temporarily. The secrecy and mistrust around his pursuit of Dexter weighs on Deborah, and she takes it personally. She can't accept that someone she's with would suspect her brother. This is, of course, years before she knows her brother is actually a serial killer, but the emotional reaction is real, and it becomes its own kind of institutional pressure against Quinn following the lead further. And when Quinn eventually lets the investigation go, not through a formal decision, but through the gradual abandonment of a lead that became too professionally dangerous to pursue, Deborah never learns why he was suspicious in the first place or what Liddy found. She knows that Quinn looked into Dexter. She doesn't know what looking into Dexter produced. That information gap is part of what allows her to maintain, for another year, the fiction that her brother has never been seriously suspected by anyone who mattered. The truth of Quinn's investigation disappears with Liddy's phone records, and Deborah is left with a partial picture that is less alarming than the full one. Deb's protective instinct toward Dexter, entirely understandable, built from years of genuine sibling love, functions across the show as a kind of invisible shield around him within the department. Anyone who gets suspicious of Dexter has to deal at some level with the fact that his sister is also a detective in the same building, and that expressing suspicion about Dexter means entering into conflict with someone who has a personal stake in it. The blood drop on Quinn's shoe, the surveillance footage that got away, the deleted phone records, that's the archaeology of another near miss, another correct instinct that the institutional environment converted into a dead end. There's a specific detail in the Liddy storyline that I find genuinely interesting from a procedural standpoint, and it's this. Liddy is good at his job. The surveillance he runs on Dexter is methodical, patient, and produces real results. The footage he gets of Dexter and Lumen is damning. The profile he builds of Dexter's movement patterns and off-the-books activities is incomplete and only partly accurate. He's suspended and disgraced, but he hasn't forgotten how to investigate, and what he's investigating is real. Which means Miami Metro came very close in Season 5 to having hard video evidence of Dexter disposing of a body. That evidence was in the hands of a former officer with a grudge and a financial relationship with a currently serving detective, and the chain of custody was entirely unauthorized, which made it essentially unusable in any official proceeding. But it existed, it was real, and the only reason it didn't become the thread that ended Dexter's run was that Dexter found the van first. The blood drop on Quinn's shoe is the enduring symbol of this near miss, and it's worth examining what it represents. LaGuerta notices it immediately, and LaGuerta's forensic eye is actually quite sharp when she wants it to be. She identifies the blood on Quinn's shoe as a potential connection to Liddy's death. She has Quinn escorted back to the station, she pursues the implication, and then the lab results come back and the procedural machinery of defending Quinn begins, and Dexter controls the narrative because Dexter is the department's blood expert and also the person who put Liddy's blood on Quinn's shoe. The evidence that nearly exposed Dexter gets processed by Dexter, the evidence room problem again in its most direct form. What Quinn deletes from Liddy's phone is also worth thinking about. Those call records, if they'd been preserved, would have established a direct connection between Quinn and Liddy's surveillance operation, which would have established that there was a surveillance operation, which would have raised the question of what the operation produced, which would have required an explanation of why the footage no longer existed. Each link in that chain is a step towards something the department would have had to address. Quinn severs the first link and the chain disappears. The institution's rules about evidence preservation, the same rules designed to protect investigations, work here to protect Dexter by making the violation of those rules the dominant story. Season 6 ends with an image that I don't think the show has fully gotten credit for, as a moment of pure structural audacity. Deborah Morgan, following the Doomsday Killer investigation through a season in which she's been promoted to Lieutenant of Homicide and is arguably functioning at the peak of her professional competence, walks into a church. She's gone there because Dexter said he'd be there and she wants to talk to him. She's doing her job. And she finds her brother kneeling beside the body of Travis Marshall, having just killed him, with the plastic wrap and the tools still present. She sees it. There is no ambiguity. Dexter does try to hide what happened. There's a moment, one of the more remarkable pieces of acting Michael C. Hall and Jennifer Carpenter do together, where they just look at each other and then the episode ends. What Deborah does in that moment is the most complete single failure in Miami Metro's history, and also, paradoxically, the most understandable thing any character does in the entire series. She doesn't call it in, she doesn't draw her weapon, she doesn't arrest her brother, she stands there and absorbs what she's seeing, and the decision she makes, not yet a fully formed conscious decision, more a pre-rational response, is to be his sister before she's a detective. Now, before we get to what Deborah does next, I want to stay with the immediate moment for a bit, because I think the show is doing something specific with it that doesn't always get acknowledged. Deborah doesn't know yet that Dexter is a serial killer. She knows that she has just walked in on her brother killing someone. Those two things are not quite the same thing. What she's seeing in that specific moment is an act she can't yet contextualize. She doesn't know about the code, doesn't know about the blood slides, doesn't know about 20 years of precisely targeted vigilante killings. She knows her brother, who she loves, is standing over a dead body. That specific quality of not knowing enough to know makes the moment both more human and more interesting than the straightforward detective ignores a murder framing suggests. Deborah isn't ignoring a murder. She's confronted with something her existing map of the world can't immediately process. And she freezes in the way that people freeze when the framework they've used to understand their life suddenly doesn't fit the information in front of them. In the aftermath, when Dexter tells her what he is and what he does, she has to process two things simultaneously: the immediate horror of the specific act she witnessed and the retroactive reframing of her entire relationship with her brother across her whole life. The show takes this seriously. Deborah's response in season 7 is messy and inconsistent and sometimes contradictory, and that's accurate. That's what it looks like when someone's understanding of their own history has to be rebuilt from scratch. But the institutional failure is real. Deborah Morgan, Lieutenant of Homicide, watched her brother kill someone and chose not to report it. Not because she approved, not because she found the killing justified in any clean way, but because the personal bond was stronger than the professional obligation. And in that choice, the institution lost its most complete opportunity. because Deborah didn't have circumstantial evidence. She didn't have a theory. She didn't have a blood slide or a partial footprint or a corrected GPS reading. She had direct visual witness testimony from a trained homicide detective who had seen her brother in the act. There are no evidentiary challenges to that case. There is no reasonable doubt. If Deborah had picked up her phone, the investigation would have been over before season 7 started. She didn't pick up the phone, and in not picking up the phone, she stepped across a line that changed everything for her from that point forward. The institution failed here, not through bureaucracy or professional blindness or inadequate evidence protocols. It failed because a person chose her family. There's no systemic fix for that. It's the oldest human thing there is. In the weeks following the church, Deborah slowly extracts the full picture from Dexter. The blood slides, the code, the decades of kills, Harry's involvement in designing the whole system. And she doesn't arrest him, she doesn't walk away from him. She does something more complicated and in some ways more damning. She accepts him, or begins the process of trying to. She becomes the person who knows Dexter's secret and chooses, provisionally and at enormous personal cost, to keep knowing it without reporting it. The show handles Deborah's processing of this information in a way I genuinely admire. There's no single clean decision. There's not a scene where Deborah sits down and makes a rational calculation about loyalty versus professional obligation. It's messier than that. She's angry. She tries to get Dexter to check himself into a facility as if serial killing is something that can be addressed with inpatient care. She tries to establish that he'll stop. She wavers between wanting to help him and wanting to turn him in, and knowing she can't turn him in because she loves him and because something in her, some version of the knowledge Dokes had, finally landing in her, has always known there was something here that she didn't quite want to look at directly. The show is honest about the fact that Deborah's decision not to report Dexter is not a purely rational or admirable one. It costs her. Every subsequent compromise costs her more. And the institution she works for, the institution she has dedicated her professional identity to, is, from the end of season 6 forward, being failed by her every single day. Not through incompetence, through the specific, active, daily choice to protect her brother at the expense of the investigation that should be her purpose. Of everything Miami Metro does across 8 seasons of Dexter's active career, the investigation that Maria LaGuerta runs in season 7 is the most methodically correct, the most carefully evidenced, and the most completely legitimate. It is also the investigation that ends with its lead investigator dead in a shipping container, shot by the sister of the man she was investigating. LaGuerta finds a charred blood slide at the Travis Marshall Church crime scene. The slide is the physical calling card of the Bay Harbor Butcher, a type of evidence that was never widely publicized, that mostly only someone directly connected to the original investigation would know to look for. And LaGuerta, who never fully accepted the official conclusion that James Dokes was the butcher, immediately understands what finding it means. Her first decision is the most significant one. She takes the slide to a private lab. She doesn't run it through Miami Metro's forensics unit. She doesn't involve Masuka. She goes outside the institutional chain entirely, and the reason she gives is that she doesn't want to tip her hand before she has something concrete. But as we talked about earlier, there's a deeper instinct at work here. LaGuerta is operating on a half-formed understanding that the chain of evidence inside her own department is somehow unreliable for this particular investigation. She's right about that. She just doesn't yet know who makes it unreliable or why. The private lab confirms the blood in the slide doesn't belong to Travis Marshall. It belongs to someone else, an earlier victim. Someone Dexter collected a trophy from during a kill that predates the church incident. LaGuerta cross-references this with records of who had access to the church during the relevant time frame and starts building a suspect list. Then she opens Frank Lundy's old notebooks. This is where the investigation starts to get genuinely impressive. Lundy's notebooks contain his working theories from the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation, theories he never fully publicized. partial conclusions that didn't make it into the official record. LaGuardia reads them and starts to see what Lundy was seeing. The butcher was someone connected to law enforcement. The butcher was someone whose professional knowledge influenced how the bodies were disposed of. The butcher was someone whose profile, when you lay it over the Miami Metro employee roster, starts to resolve toward a very specific direction. She tracks the marina records. She identifies which slips were rented by Miami Metro employees. She runs a list against what she knows about the Bay Harbor butcher's operational geography, where the bodies were found, where the boat would need to have been docked. The list narrows. She asks Deborah to help her with the investigation, framing it as a cold case review, and Deborah, who now knows exactly where the investigation is heading, starts feeding her carefully wrong information and steering her toward other leads. This is actually where the Season 7 storyline becomes genuinely painful to watch if you're tracking LaGuardia's investigation for what it is. A smart, experienced, committed investigator working a correct case with incomplete information, being actively undermined by her own subordinate because that subordinate has a personal stake in the investigation failing. Matthews is a different kind of obstacle. LaGuardia brings him in as an ally. He knows what she knows about the blood slide, and his initial response is to dismiss her suspicions. Then Dexter gets to Matthews. He and Deborah plant additional evidence that steers the case back toward Doke's, creating the appearance of confirmation that the Bay Harbor butcher investigation was correctly closed. Matthews visits LaGuardia and tells her he's satisfied Dokes was guilty after all. She accuses him of protecting the Morgan family because of his relationship with Harry. He tells her to let it go. She refuses. She brings in Hector Estrada, one of the men responsible for the death of Dexter's biological mother, Laura M.O.E. Zaire. A connection LaGuardia has begun to suspect is relevant to Dexter's motives and uses him as a piece in the trap she's setting. She arranges a meeting that she hopes will draw Dexter out and create a confrontation she can observe and document. She's constructing a sting. LaGuardia is right about Dexter's guilt. She's right about Dokes' innocence. She's right about the Estrada connection. She's right about what the blood slide means. She is, in this investigation, correct at every single significant step. And she dies in a shipping container when Deborah, faced with a choice between allowing LaGuardia to arrest Dexter and shooting the person standing between her and her brother's freedom, shoots LaGuardia. Deborah shot her to save Dexter. That's the simple version. The more complicated version is that Deborah has, by the end of Season 7, been irreparably changed by what she knows and what she's already covered up. She's already lied to LaGuardia. She's already planted evidence. She's already crossed enough lines that the idea of going back, of allowing LaGuardia to succeed, of watching everything unravel, has become unthinkable. The shooting at the end of Season 7 isn't a sudden choice. It's the logical endpoint of every compromise Deborah has made since Season 6. LaGuardia's investigation was the only one across the entire series that should have worked. The evidence was real, the methodology was sound, the investigator was correct, and Miami Metro's response to it was to obstruct it through every official and unofficial channel available until it became a question of bullets. Let me also say something specific about what Deborah's role in the obstruction tells us about how far the institutional failure had spread by Season 7. Deborah is not a peripheral figure at this point. She's the lieutenant of homicide. She is, in organizational terms, the investigation's natural lead officer, the person who should be allocating resources to it, reviewing its progress, ensuring it's being pursued correctly. Instead, she's the investigation's primary saboteur. She's in the room where the decisions get made, and she's steering them away from the truth. The institution's failure in Season 7 isn't just that LaGuardia doesn't have enough support, it's that the person in the department best positioned to support the investigation is actively working against it. This is the most complete version of the institutional failure, not incompetence, not bad luck. Active suppression of a correct investigation by the people inside the institution who had the most personal reason to prevent it from succeeding. The Estrada angle of La Guerta's investigation is the one I find most quietly impressive from a pure investigative standpoint, because it requires her to make a connection that Dexter himself doesn't realize she's making. Hector Estrada is one of the men responsible for the death of Laura Moe Zaire, Dexter's biological mother. His connection to Dexter is personal and deep and almost entirely hidden from the official record. La Guerta finds this connection and uses it as a thread in her trap. She arranges for Estrada to be released from custody and positioned in a way that she hopes will draw Dexter out. This means La Guerta has figured out that Dexter's killings are not random. She's understood that there's a logic to his victim selection that goes back further than the Bay Harbor butcher pattern, that it's personal in some cases, motivated by connections she can only partially trace. She's not just building a case based on physical evidence. She's building a psychological profile of someone she's never officially suspected, using connections she's assembled from fragments. That's genuinely impressive investigative work. It's exactly the kind of pattern recognition that makes a good detective different from a good bureaucrat. And then there's the position Deborah finds herself in when La Guerta brings her into the investigation. Deborah is now the lieutenant of homicide. La Guerta is bringing the case to her in part because she trusts her, and in part because she's read Deborah's loyalty to her brother and has not fully accounted for how far that loyalty extends. Deborah's role in La Guerta's investigation as an apparent ally who is actually an active counter-investigator is one of the show's more quietly uncomfortable pieces of plotting. Deborah steers La Guerta toward wrong conclusions, diverts her attention, reports back to Dexter on what La Guerta is finding. She is, by this point, genuinely working against the official investigation she's supposed to be supporting. The fact that La Guerta doesn't catch this is perhaps the only real investigative failure of her Season 7 arc. She trusts Deborah too much. She doesn't account for the possibility that Deborah's loyalty to Dexter might be stronger than Deborah's professional obligation, which is understandable because from La Guerta's perspective, Deborah is a good detective who has demonstrated the kind of career commitment that usually indicates professional identity above personal loyalty. What La Guerta doesn't know is that Deborah now knows everything and that the person she's read as a professional ally has been transformed by that knowledge into something else. I want to spend some time here not on the investigative failure, we've covered that, but on what carrying that failure costs a person. Because I think the tendency when talking about Deborah's arc is to focus on the dramatic moments, finding Dexter at the church, shooting La Guerta, confessing to Quinn. But the damage isn't in the dramatic moments. It's in all the ordinary ones that follow. Deborah gets up in the morning and goes to work. She sits in briefings about homicides. She reviews evidence in cases involving people who committed the crimes they're accused of. And she does her job correctly on those cases because the professional machinery of being a good detective is still there, still operational, just disconnected from the ethical foundation that gave it meaning. She knows that what her department does has value. She knows this because she's been doing it for years, and she's seen the difference it makes. She just also knows that the person she works most closely with, the one she protected, the one she covered for, the one she pointed a gun at La Guerta for, is someone who has been operating in fundamental opposition to everything that value is supposed to represent. That cognitive load is not small. The show's Season 8 Deborah is a person running a daily deficit between who she is and who she was, and nothing in the institutional environment she's operating in can bridge that gap. The institution doesn't know what she's carrying, it can't, and so it continues to demand from her the version of professional performance she no longer has the internal capacity to fully sustain. Her PTSD takes the form of specific recurring images. She's in the shipping container, but in the flashback she shoots Dexter instead of La Guerta. She replays the decision. She replays the alternative. Dr. Vogel, the neuropsychiatrist who arrives in Season 8 with her own complicated connection to Dexter's history, begins treating Deborah specifically for the dissociation and guilt that are starting to pull her apart. And what Vogel tells her that she had no choice, that she saved the life she was capable of saving, is probably not inaccurate, but it doesn't land. because Deborah knows what she gave up to save it. There's a scene early in season 8 where Deborah, having been drinking, walks into Miami Metro and finds Quinn and starts trying to tell him what she did. She says she killed La Huerta. Quinn thinks she's drunk and distressed and doesn't understand what she's saying. He pulls her into an interview room. Dexter is called. Dexter gives Deborah an injection of M99, a sedative used to subdue targets for his kill ritual, now used to silence his sister before she can confess to a murder she committed to protect him, and carries her out of the building. He handcuffs her to a couch at her beach house for her own protection. That sequence is, if you strip away the emotional context and just describe what happens, genuinely horrifying. Dexter sedates his sister with the same drug he uses on his murder victims to prevent her from telling the truth. And Deborah, in her relatively lucid moments, understands that this is what her life has become. She's not just covering for her brother, she's being managed by him in the specific clinical way that he manages threats to his survival. The show doesn't excuse any of this. It shows you the bill being paid. Season 8's Deborah is a person in the process of coming apart, using substances, disconnected from her professional identity, unable to sustain the investment in justice that defined her character for 6 seasons. She briefly goes to work for a private investigator. She tries to rebuild some version of an ethical framework for herself outside the department where she can no longer comfortably exist. And she comes back because Dexter is her brother, and that fact turns out to be more durable than almost anything else about her. She comes back and she gets shot by Oliver Saxon, a serial killer connected to Dr. Vogel, and she dies from a stroke caused by the complications of that wound. Dexter disconnects her life support. He carries her body out to his boat and buries her at sea. The department's failure to catch Dexter didn't just leave him free. It cost Deborah Morgan everything: her professional identity, her moral framework, her sense of herself as someone who stood on the right side of the line she'd drawn her whole life. And ultimately her life, indirectly, because if Dexter had been caught, she wouldn't have been in the position where Saxon could use her as leverage. The institution's failure moved through her like a fault line, and by season 8, the damage was done. That's the human accounting behind the procedural one. There's a scene in season 8 that I always find particularly painful to watch, and it's quiet enough that I think it can get lost in the larger noise of the final season. Deborah has been working for a private investigator trying to rebuild some version of a professional identity outside Miami Metro. She's tracking Hannah Moo Kay. She finds the fugitive, and in the process of pursuing the killer as a private investigator, the complications of Dexter's world intrude in a way that gets her shot. She ends up in hospital with a brain injury from the gunshot wound and associated stroke complications, and the show handles this with a directness that I appreciate. She doesn't recover, she deteriorates. Dexter disconnects her life support. The sequence of events that leads to Deborah's death is traceable directly to Dexter's continued involvement with Oliver Saxon, the brain surgeon, who has a connection to Dexter's history with Dr. Vogel. If Dexter had not been the person he is, Saxon would have had no reason to target Deborah. If Deborah had not been drawn back into the orbit of Dexter's dangerous professional world, she would not have been in the line of fire. The chain of causation runs from Dexter's existence through his choices through her exposure. And Dexter knows this. His season 8 internal monologue returns repeatedly to the idea that everyone he cares about suffers because of what he is. That's not self-pity exactly. The show doesn't play it that way. It's more like an accounting. He's adding up the bill that his continued survival has run. Rita, Deborah, the various collateral damages of 2 decades of killings and the relationships and investigations those killings have distorted. He reaches the conclusion that the only way to protect the people he loves, Hannah and Harrison, his last intact connection, is to remove himself from proximity to them. Hence the hurricane, hence Oregon. Miami Metro's 8-season failure to catch Dexter cost them Maria La Huerta. It cost Deborah Morgan. It bent Quinn into unauthorized surveillance and into being implicated in Liddy's death. It left Matthews compromised and guilt-carrying for decades. The institution didn't just fail to find its killer. The search for him, each time someone got close, exacted a specific price from the person doing the searching. There's also a detail from Season 8 that connects back to all of this in a way I find genuinely painful. Deborah's brief attempt to work as a private investigator to rebuild some kind of professional identity outside the department is in some ways the show's saddest image of institutional failure's human cost. She cannot be a Miami Metro detective anymore, not really, not in the way she used to be. The knowledge she carries is incompatible with the professional identity she spent her life building. She knows what she knows, and what she knows has made her into something she can no longer recognize as the person she was in Season 1, working Vice in a provocative undercover outfit and pushing to join Homicide on the ice truck killer case and swearing at Dexter for being late to the scene. The institution's failure didn't just leave Dexter free. It transformed the people nearest to him into people who could no longer operate cleanly within the institution. Deborah can't be the detective she was. Quinn has information he can't act on, and records he's deleted. Matthews has a history he's managed and a secret he's kept for decades. The institution's blindness required, over time, the active cooperation of individuals inside it, and that cooperation cost each of those individuals something. They became, in various degrees and in various ways, accessories to the thing the institution was failing to address. And then there's the ending. The Season 8 finale of Dexter is, by any measure, one of the most discussed finales in the history of television drama. Discussed not always in the most charitable terms, but discussed. And within that larger conversation about what the episode does and doesn't accomplish, there's one specific detail that I think deserves its own moment of recognition as the definitive final act of Miami Metro's failure. Dexter Morgan drives his boat into a hurricane. He does this deliberately after taking Deborah's body out to sea and burying her in the ocean. He drives his boat into the storm, and the wreckage is subsequently found by Coast Guard patrols with no apparent survivors. Angel is notified that Dexter is presumed dead. The department accepts this. The file closes. Somewhere in Oregon, a man with a grown-out beard and a flannel jacket sits at a wooden table in a rented room. He looks out the window. He turns back to face forward. He opens his eyes. He stares directly into the camera. He is Dexter Morgan, alive and working at a lumber mill. Nobody at Miami Metro is looking for him. Nobody connects his disappearance to the Bay Harbor butcher case that was officially resolved years ago, or to LaGuardia's investigation that officially closed with her death, or to Quinn's abandoned surveillance operation, or to any of the threads that, if you pulled them together from one end, would lead to a very different conclusion about the forensics analyst who just drove his boat into a storm. The department's last official act in relation to Dexter Morgan is to mark him as a tragic casualty. They send their condolences. Batista is notified and presumably has a moment of genuine grief. And that's it. That's how it ends, officially. The Bay Harbor butcher was James Dokes, who died in 2007. Dexter Morgan was a good colleague who loved his sister and died in a hurricane trying to deal with her death. File closed. Let me be specific about what that means in terms of the total accounting. Dokes caught Dexter in the act in Season 2 and died in a cabin explosion. Lundy built the most accurate FBI profile of the butcher that anyone ever constructed and was murdered by a separate antagonist in Season 4. His investigation into the Trinity killer closed without ever revisiting what he suspected about the butcher's identity. LaGuardia built the only legitimate evidence-based case ever assembled against Dexter and was killed by Deborah in Season 7. Quinn had surveillance footage that would have ended the matter and destroyed it to protect himself. Deborah knew everything from Season 7 onward and chose silence, then complicity, then crime. 8 seasons, 8 years of Dexter Morgan operating inside Miami Metro's building, using their databases, processing their evidence, testifying in their cases. 20-plus years of kills, beginning with the structured vigilantism Harry designed and expanding in various directions as the seasons progress. More than 130 people killed, according to the count Dexter has at various points in the series. And the department's official record contains none of it. The man who killed all those people isn't in prison. He isn't publicly known. He isn't even considered a missing person of interest in anything. He's just dead, presumed. And somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, he's cutting lumber and presumably contemplating the various ways in which the universe has declined to punish him. There's something almost Shakespearean about the final image of Dexter staring into the camera. It's a challenge. It's also, if you want to read it charitably, an acknowledgement of the absurdity of his survival. He's still here. He's still free. And Miami Metro, 8 seasons, and all those near misses behind him is still the least effective investigative unit in the history of fictional law enforcement. And they don't even know enough to be embarrassed about it. Let me also note what the department's final official accounting of Dexter Morgan includes, because I think the specifics of that record are interesting. From Miami Metro's perspective, Dexter Morgan was a reliable forensics analyst who worked at the department for years, the adoptive son of a respected former officer, the victim of a traumatic childhood that he overcame to build a functional professional life, the widower of Rita Morgan, who was killed by the Trinity killer while the investigation was active, and a man who was presumed dead in a hurricane, possibly overcome by grief after his sister was shot and ultimately died. That's the official picture. That's what the files say. The files don't say, and also he killed over 100 people. The files don't say, and also his colleague Dokes was right about him from day one and died trying to expose him. The files don't say, and also the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation was compromised at the evidentiary level by the person assigned to analyze the evidence. The files don't say, and also, the most senior female officer in the department's history was murdered by his sister to protect his secret. The official record is a masterwork of incompleteness. There's a detail in the closing moments of the series finale that I always return to. When the Coast Guard reports find the wreckage of Dexter's boat, Angel is notified as the department's point of contact. Batista receives the news. He presumably feels some version of grief. He and Dexter have worked alongside each other for years. They've been through a great deal together. Batista is a man who feels things genuinely and doesn't hide it. He closes the file. He tells whoever needs to be told. And Dexter Morgan's official story ends with a boat wreck and a presumed drowning. No one ever tells Batista what was in that file. No one ever tells him what Dokes was trying to say. No one ever tells him that the man he just processed the death paperwork for was the Bay Harbor Butcher in the original series, and also probably a great deal else besides. Batista gets to keep the version of Dexter that was real to him, the colleague, the blood guy, the slightly awkward man who brought donuts. And that version of Dexter, the one that existed in the minds of people who worked with him and never knew him, is the version that gets buried along with the official missing person report. So that's Miami Metro's record with Dexter. From the beginning to the end, from Harry Morgan handing his son a forensics badge to a Coast Guard patrol writing up a missing, presumed dead report on a man who was very much alive, the institution had every opportunity available to it. It had structural mechanisms. It had periodically genuinely competent people. It had the right evidence in the right hands on more than one occasion, and it never closed the gap. But I want to end on a slightly different note, because I think if you only take away from this evening the idea that Miami Metro was simply bad at their jobs, you're missing something important about what Dexter was actually doing across those 8 seasons. The show was never really asking whether Dexter would be caught. It was asking whether Dexter could catch himself. Whether a man built by trauma and trained by a fundamentally compromised moral framework could find his way to something more human, whether connection, love, The weight of other people's lives could eventually reach him in a way that his own psychology couldn't. Miami Metro had to fail for that story to exist. If Lundy had followed the right lead in Season 2, if Dokes had survived, if La Guerta had had even one more week to build her case, there's no story after that, or rather there's a very different story, a much shorter one. The institution's failure is the space in which everything meaningful happens. Dexter's relationship with Rita, his complicated friendship with Miguel Prato, his strange partnership with Lumen, the long unraveling of his relationship with Deborah. All of it lives in the gap between what Miami Metro could see and what was actually there. And the failure, when you trace it all the way back, wasn't entirely about incompetence. It was about people choosing other things. Harry chose his son over his institution. Rita chose stability over suspicion. Quinn chose self-preservation over a lead. Deborah chose her brother over her badge. La Guerta chose James Dokes' vindication over departmental peace, the one choice in this list that sent her back into the Bay Harbor butcher case and ended in a shipping container with Dexter and Deborah confronting her. The institution failed when people inside it were people first, which is, depending on your mood, either a tragedy or just a description of how institutions always work. They're full of people. People have loyalties that exceed their professional ones. And Dexter, who spent his whole life performing the appearance of personhood while feeling like something else was underneath, turned out to be exactly the person who could exploit that. He found the places where human loyalty was stronger than institutional obligation, and he lived there for 8 seasons, and then he drove a boat into a storm and started over somewhere else. Since we're on the topic of what the show was ultimately doing with all of this, I want to say something about what I think is the real legacy of Miami Metro's failure, which isn't the body count or the investigative record or even La Guerta's death. It's what the failure reveals about Dexter himself. Every near miss tells you something specific about who Dexter was at that moment. Dokes getting close in Season 2 tells you that Dexter's emotional life was starting to generate noise he couldn't fully control. His relationship with Rita, his grief over Harry's revealed suicide, the complicated feelings the Bay Harbor butcher investigation was stirring up. Dokes read that noise correctly. La Guerta getting close in Season 7 tells you that the accumulated weight of a long career of killing was starting to produce slippage, a bloodslide left at a church. A sequence of events slightly less controlled than they would have been in the clean years of early operation. The near misses map to the moments when Dexter was most distracted by the effort of becoming human, which is the real irony of the whole thing. The more Dexter invested in connection, in Rita, in Harrison, in his complicated love for Deborah, in his strange, genuine feeling for Miguel Prato before it turned, the more he generated the kinds of inconsistencies and emotional preoccupations that made him catchable. The version of Dexter who never got close to being caught was the version who felt less. The version who nearly got caught in Season 2 was the version falling in love with Rita. The version who left the bloodslide at the church was the version who had just killed Travis Marshall, in the specific emotional context of what that investigation meant to him. So the failure of Miami Metro isn't ultimately about their investigative competence, or their resources, or their access to evidence. It's about the gap between what institutional investigation can do and what this particular killer was doing. Dexter wasn't hiding from a system, he was living inside one. And systems, by their nature, aren't designed to catch what's living inside them. They're designed to catch what comes from outside. That's not a criticism of Miami Metro specifically. It's a description of how institutions work, full stop. Harry understood that. He designed his son's protection around it. And Dexter, across the full span of the show, proved the design sound at enormous cost to everyone who came close enough to test it. Miami Metro couldn't catch the cold version of Dexter. They came closest to catching the warmer one. There's something in that the show never quite says out loud, but that I think is there if you're looking for it. Wherever you are tonight, I hope this has been a comfortable companion for the evening. There's more of this universe to explore, Dexter. New Blood does genuinely interesting things with the question of whether Dexter could sustain a quiet life and what it looks like when he can't. And Resurrection is doing its own work with what happens to a man who has survived everything the world has tried to do to him. Future evenings, both of those. But for now, the blood slides are back in the air conditioning unit. Miami Metro has filed their last report. And some